It's Friday, August 2nd, here in Seoul.
Coming up on NEWSCENTER tonight. President Moon Jae-in expresses deep regret over Japan's decision to remove South Korea from its whitelist of trading partners. He calls the move a reckless decision and a clear trade retaliation, adding that Tokyo will face the consequences.
South Korea lays out plans to counter Japan's latest trade restrictions, and that includes removing Japan from its own whitelist of trusted trading nations. We have the details.
While much attention is focused on the trilateral South Korea, U.S.-Japan foreign ministers meeting in Bangkok, the top diplomats of Singapore and China slammed Japan's move, saying Tokyo, instead of removing countries from its list, should have included more Asian nations.
And North Korea launches missiles for the third time in a week, sparking condemnation from around the world. U.S. President Donald Trump, however, again downplays concerns. NEWSCENTER begins now. Good evening and welcome to Arirang NEWSCENTER. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Arirang.
And I'm Han-Dan. Thanks for joining us. Ignoring South Korea's continued calls for dialogue to ease tensions, Japan has decided to drop South Korea from its so-called whitelist of trusted trading partners.
This has worsened what is already fragile tensions between the two sides, as the move will make it harder for Korea to import hundreds of products needed by South Korean companies. Our Kim Mo-kyun has our top story.
In a cabinet meeting held at Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's official residence at 10 a.m. on Friday, the Japanese cabinet decided to exclude South Korea from its whitelist of 27 countries, given preferential treatment in trade procedures. South Korea is the only Asian nation on Japan's trade whitelist and has been on the list since its inclusion in 2004. Addressing reporters after the meeting, Japan's Trade Minister Hiroshige Seko said that the cabinet passed an ordinance on removing South Korea from the whitelist. The minister stressed that the measures come as part of Japan's efforts to re-examine its management system, pointing out that South Korea's export control system is lax.
Our latest decision came with the basis that South Korea was inadequate in its export controls and that we wanted to take appropriate measures to manage our exports. We completely did not intend to influence our ties with Seoul, and it's not an act of retaliation against anything.
Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga also reiterated that the measures were not financial regulations aimed at souring ties and that its treatment of trade with South Korea would only change to a level similar to other Asian countries. Suga also said that the measures will be made public on Wednesday and that it will officially come into effect on the 28th of August after Japan's Emperor Naruhito makes a proclamation. The removal of South Korea from the so-called whitelist of 27 countries is seen as a second retaliatory measure by Tokyo after its July 4 imposition of tighter restrictions on exports to Seoul of key materials used for semiconductor and display production. Despite Japan's denial, many still speculate that the export curbs were a sign of retaliation against South Korean Supreme Court's decision that hold Japanese companies liable for wartime forced labor. Nevertheless, Tokyo's decision to scrap Seoul from its whitelist is feared to cause significant delays and disruptions to imports from Japan, as Japanese exporters will need individual authorization rather than fast-track approval for exports of more than 1,000 dual-use items to South Korea. Kim Mo-kyun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in, during an emergency cabinet meeting this afternoon, warned that Japan will face severe consequences for what he called its reckless act. Our presidential correspondent Shin Se-min now joins us live from the Blue House. Se-min, tell us more.
Town, it's looking a lot like an eye for an eye situation this Friday. President Moon Jae-in, during an emergency cabinet meeting earlier this afternoon that was beamed live throughout the nation for the first time since the turn of the year, upgraded his level of criticism against Japan. Now, President Moon described Japan's decision to drop South Korea from its list of trading partners as a grave challenge to the two countries' relations and a selfish move that will greatly hamper the global economy. This is him earlier today.
우리 정부와 국제사회의 외교적 해결 노력을 외면하고 상황을 악화시켜온 책임이 일본 정부에 있는 것이 명확해진 이상 앞으로 벌어질 사태의 책임도 전적으로 일본 정부에 있다는 점을 분명히 경고합니다.
The president called the decision a case of clear, unjust economic retaliation over South Korea's top court's ruling that ordered Japanese companies to compensate for Koreans used for forced labor during colonial rule. He said his government will take corresponding measures in a resolute way and said despite Japan being an economic powerhouse, South Korea has its own methods to counter Japan's attempt to damage the economy.
As you've said, the president's message today wasn't only speaking to Japan here, he also made an appeal to the people of Korea. Tell us more on that.
Right. While blasting Japan for its action today, President Moon called on the people of Korea that they need to stand together as a united force. He said when people of Korea believe in the power of its government and the companies, both large and small, the country can overcome this crisis as a whole.
지금의 도전을 오히려 기회로 여기고 새로운 경제 도약의 계기로 삼는다면 우리는 충분히 일본을 이겨낼 수 있습니다. 우리 경제가 일본 경제를 뛰어넘을 수 있습니다.
And the Deputy National Security Advisor also reiterating the nation's confidence level, saying that as a whole, the nation can surely go through this and will push through it no matter what. President Moon also left the door open to Japan, though, saying that one way to stop all this and the vicious cycle for tit for tat is for Japan to immediately withdraw its wrongful measures and return to the table for talks.
Now, another pressing issue in regard to Japan's decision is that the issue of trade is being linked to the issue of security. And this is about whether or not South Korea is going to renew its military intelligence sharing pact with Japan.
Right. The presidential office confirmed again today that it is reviewing the possibility of dropping that pact with Japan called GSOMIA, a crucial pact that is in exchanging military information between the two countries, and that is up for renewal this month. And that could be included as a comprehensive measure that the South Korean government is reviewing.
The government will take comprehensive response measures, such as reviewing whether it's right to continue sharing sensitive military information with a country that claims to have trust and security-related issues with us.
On the other hand, GSOMIA is seen as crucial at a time when North Korea continues to test missiles and projectiles. GSOMIA had been a key element in three-way security cooperation with the U.S., and so scrapping it has been a concern for Washington as well. So we're going to have to see whether this does truly become a matter of security that's been moved on from the matter of trade. Taeun?
Our Shin Se-min at the Blue House for us tonight. Thank you. South Korea's Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi has also called Japan's latest decision an unfair economic retaliation that destroys the trust and cooperation built between Seoul and Tokyo. Expressing deep regrets and concerns, the minister also announced detailed plans on how Seoul will deal with Japan's additional export restrictions. Our Kim Da-mi tells us more.
South Korea's Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi said that South Korea will thoroughly and strongly cope with Japan's latest decision, as it has prepared countermeasures for all possible scenarios. That includes removing Japan from its whitelist of 29 trusted trading partners.
While continuing to solve diplomatic relations, we will strengthen our export process by removing Japan off our whitelist.
Noting that such a tit-for-tat decision was inevitable, the minister promised to provide details on what materials would be affected and what impact that would have on Japan next week. The briefing on Friday afternoon further included detailed plans to support the local companies that will suffer the most right away. He noted that 159 parts and materials will have a direct effect on companies.
We will closely monitor the 159 materials by breaking them down into sections based on reliance on Japan, negative impact, and replaceability. We will extend the storage period and provide tax incentives for searching for alternatives overseas.
Additional financial support includes tax incentives and providing up to $5 billion of working capital. Highlighting the importance of localization, the minister promised pouring over $1 billion into R&D, especially on items crucial for the supply chain. As well as creating extra funds to secure key materials from overseas and through mergers and acquisitions, the government will provide detailed plans next week for increasing the competitiveness of parts and materials. South Korea will also speed up the process of taking Tokyo's unfair decision to the WTO. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Amid the war of words between foreign ministers Kang Kyung-hwa and Taro Kono at the ASEAN Regional Foreign Ministers meeting over in Thailand, the ministers held a trilateral meeting with their closest ally, the U.S., just about half an hour ago. For more, we connect live to our foreign affairs correspondent Lee Ji-won in Bangkok. Ji-won, fill us in.
Well, Town, actually, the meeting is expected to finish in the next few minutes or so, and so we do not yet have any details on it for now. What many of us had initially expected is that Pompeo would play the role of mediator, according to what he said en route to Bangkok a few days ago. Speaking to traveling press, Secretary Pompeo said that he will mediate between the two countries and help them find a path forward. But with the war of words between Seoul and Tokyo having gotten fierce, it remains to be seen whether they discuss the issue today. Meanwhile, Ministers Kang and Kono were supposed to have their separate bilateral talks with Secretary Pompeo before the trilateral sit-down, but both of them got canceled due to the delay in schedule.
In Ji-won, we hear that the main event, the ASEAN Regional Forum, is also currently underway.
Yes, Town, the ARF is where all the 10 ASEAN ministers and their 10 dialogue partners take part, and it's also the only meeting in which the North Koreans participate. So North Korea's ambassador to Thailand, Kim Dae-bong, is also at the event. While we also don't have much details on it for now, the meeting normally focuses on the political and regional security issues, so we're not sure if Kang will bring up or has brought up Seoul's trade issue with Tokyo at this meeting. But we are expecting the diplomats to send out a message of concern and or warning to the North Koreans as they've been firing missiles lately. I'll bring you more updates on these talks once the details are out.
Thank you, Ji-won. Do keep us posted throughout this evening. Now, while the foreign ministers of Seoul and Tokyo are actively conveying their stances to the international society at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Thailand, a number of countries showed their support to Seoul by stressing the importance of fair and open trade. Our Seo Eun-kyung has a story.
Sources say at the closed-door meeting in Bangkok, Singapore and China expressed their support for Korea's stance against Japan's Whitelist decision. At the ASEAN Plus 3 Foreign Ministers meeting held in Bangkok on Friday, Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said Japan should add countries to its whitelist, not take them off, as part of building trust and independence for the region's co-prosperity. Balakrishnan actually put aside his prepared speech, saying he wanted to present an honest view of the matter. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi backed this up, saying that the countries of East Asia are one family, and in that sense, he regrets that these issues have arisen. Wang Yi then said such issues need to be resolved through trust and goodwill. Earlier in the session open to the media, the South Korean and Japanese foreign minister had media direct mention of each other and their trade dispute in their opening statement, which is rare in these meetings.
Held to draw your attention to the decision made by Japan just this morning to remove my country from its list of trading partners that receive comprehensive export preferential treatment, and this in a very unilateral and arbitrary manner.
Expressing grave concerns, Kang said countries should not be deterred in their collective efforts to expand free, fair, and non-discriminatory trade in the region. Responding to this, Minister Go described Kang's remarks as groundless.
Maintaining effective export control over sensitive goods and technologies from a security perspective is Japan's responsibility as a member of the international community. Japan's necessary and legitimate review of its export control is fully compatible with the free trade regime, including the WTO agreement and the relevant rules.
In the session that followed the East Asia Summit Foreign Ministers meeting, the Singaporean foreign minister expressed his concern that a major economic power has made such a unilateral decision and emphasized the importance of free trade. 서은경, Arirang News.
So as widely expected, the Japanese government took South Korea off its export whitelist today. The decision is likely to have an impact across Korea's manufacturing industries, from semiconductors to steel, as more than 1,000 items are designated as strategic goods by the Japanese government. Our Yoon Jung-min now brings us part one of our special series of reports on Japan's trade restrictions against South Korea.
1,120 strategic goods are likely to be affected due to Japan's decision to remove South Korea from its whitelist of countries which receive preferential treatment on trade as its allies for defense and security. Japanese exporters get comprehensive approval every 3 years to ship strategic goods to the countries on the whitelist, but they have to apply for case-by-case approval every 6 months to export such items to non-whitelist countries. For the countries on the whitelist, the approval takes about a week, but for non-whitelist countries, it will take about 90 days. Even for non-strategic goods, shipping to countries excluded from the list requires case-by-case approval, which is not applied to the whitelist countries. The items most likely to be affected include those used in chips and displays, automobiles, petrochemicals, machinery, steel, and aluminum. According to the Hyundai Research Institute, 48 items are heavily dependent on Japanese components or equipment, with imports from Tokyo taking more than 90% of the total imports of those goods last year. For example, more than 90% of photoresist, laser machines, and polishing machines used for making chips come from Japan. More goods used for producing petrochemicals, machinery, and steel are also dependent on Japanese suppliers. Future industries are also susceptible, including batteries used in hydrogen cars and non-memory chips. South Korean companies are likely to look for alternative suppliers or try to make some items on their own if possible. The decision to revise a trade law to remove Seoul from the whitelist came at Japan's cabinet meeting on Friday. Japan's Emperor Naruhito will announce the revision on August 7th, and the law will go into effect on August 28th. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
South Korea's first vice foreign minister summoned the Japanese ambassador in Seoul this afternoon and expressed deep regret over Japan's decision to take Seoul off its export whitelist. Cho Se-young asked that Tokyo withdraw its export curbs on 3 items. Otherwise, Seoul will take what measures it needs to. Japanese ambassador Yasumasa Nagamine answered that the export curbs are part of a review of Japan's export controls, not a complete ban on exports to South Korea. The Japanese ambassador said there have been various problems between the two countries since last year and called on Seoul instead to work to recover bilateral trust. South Korea's vice minister in turn responded that Japan's explanations are inconsistent and once again expressed deep disappointment. South Korea's parliament and political parties were united today in calling on Japan to halt its export controls on South Korea. They held emergency meetings throughout the day discussing ways to deal with Tokyo's escalating economic retaliation. Our Kim Min-ji reports.
South Korea's parliament has expressed deep regret over Japan's whitelist decision. National Assembly Speaker Moon Hee-sang said he cannot help but voice disappointment and that the Japanese government will be responsible for any diplomatic, security, or economic repercussions that its decision has from this point on.
The National Assembly will be keeping close tabs on the situation from here on and respond sternly and actively.
Rival parties also convened emergency meetings after Tokyo's announcement to discuss ways to respond. The ruling Democratic Party said it's a serious situation, adding that what's most important is for the government to support companies that will feel the blow of Japan's move down the line. The party also signaled the possible scrapping of a joint military intel pact between South Korea and Japan.
If Japan categorizes South Korea as a country it cannot trust, I wonder if we can trust them. Our military intelligence sharing pact was maintained over the years based on bilateral trust. If there's no such trust in Northeast Asia, I wonder if there's a reason to keep the deal.
The main opposition Liberty Korea party said that Japan has made a wrong decision that will further sour relations. It called on both sides to work to find a diplomatic solution, given that there's only a few weeks before the measure takes effect.
This will not only seriously damage the economies of both countries, but hurt the global value chain. Along with the public, we strongly condemn Tokyo's Whitelist decision. If there is not a realistic solution at this point, I ask all countermeasures to be focused on minimizing the fallout on our people and firms.
The minor Paramita party also raised concerns that a trade war between Seoul and Tokyo will lead the two countries on a path of mutual destruction. Left-leaning minor parties stressed the need to foster a unified national response. And in show of bipartisanship, rival lawmakers also unanimously passed a resolution urging Japan to immediately lift its export controls, saying they undermine bilateral relations and go against the principles of free trade. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, let's take a deeper dive into the latest move by Japan by getting some expert analysis, and we have three lined up. We begin with Waqas Adenwala, Asia analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit, who joins us through Skype. Mr. Adenwala, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Good evening.
First of all, I'd like to ask you, how do you gauge the impact of this so-called whitelist removal on South Korean firms and the South Korean economy?
Obviously, since South Korea is a very export-oriented and obviously external sector-focused economy, having a ban or restrictions of any sort is going to have a negative impact for this US-China trade war. The restrictions from Japan are obviously more directly against South Korea, so the impact on South Korean firms will be quite negative. South Korean economy itself has not been performing well during this year in Q1. Q2 numbers were better, but primarily because of government support. So going forward, the economy is unlikely to do fairly well in at least Q3 and 4 if you just look at 2019 numbers.
No, Mr. Adenwala, it's widely believed that Japan's first and second round of export curbs against South Korea will not only affect the South Korean economy, but also the global economy by affecting the global value chain, as many call it. Many also point out that the moves will eventually backfire on Japanese firms. Your thoughts?
Absolutely, actually, because if you think about, let's just take semiconductor industry, the three components that were restricted in the first round, yes, if you think about South Korea being the biggest chip makers, they are also the biggest clients for those Japanese producers. So effectively, Japanese restrictions have killed off the clients for all the suppliers in Japan. And when you also take about how South Korea supplies it to the rest of the world with the memory chips, Japanese firms like Sony, which use those memory chips produced in South Korea, are going to be impacted as well. So Japanese firms are going to feel the wrath of their own government's decision.
Right. And South Korea, as all this is going on, South Korea is planning to take this issue to the WTO. If not, they have already, but they're going to take the issue up again. How do you expect things to play out at the global body? Would South Korea be able to gain an upper hand in resolving this trade spat?
In plain terms, it will be actually tricky. It's not just about the upper hand or lower hand, to be honest, because the problems with the WTO is even if South Korea does get an upper hand, it's more about the time delay. The restrictions by Japan have been used, yes, unilaterally, but they're already going to come into place. So even if WTO decides in South Korea's favor, the time by which it happens, South Korean firms would have already suffered a fair amount. And also, Japan has revised the way it's actually classified as countries. So it's no longer just whitelist and non-whitelist. They've categorized countries into 4 different stages. South Korea is classified not in the first tier anymore. It's classified into tier 2. The lowest tier includes countries such as North Korea, for example. So they can basically try to justify their restrictions in the WTO body as well. So if at all, the arguments in WTO will actually drag on. In the meantime, continue to hurt South Korean companies. Even if the decision is in favor of South Korea, there's always a chance that Japan could request for an appeal, and that could again take more time. So yes, the victory for South Korea in that scenario would obviously help to, highlight to the world that how South Korea has been pursuing its stance, obviously, in a fairly right way. But then when you think about Japan pursuing their stance, they will also try to make sure that their case is strong enough as well. It's basically more about the time delay than the actual decision that will hurt Korean companies, sadly.
Right, okay. Mr. Adirwalla, that's all the time I'm afraid we have for you at the moment. Thank you ever so much for your insights. Now, let's get some more expert analysis. For that, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Kim Young-han, Professor of Global Economics at Seongkyungkwan University. Professor Kim, thank you ever so much for coming in today. Yeah. Now, similar question to the first one that we had for Mr. Adirwalla. The move is going to have an impact on Korean businesses. The local semiconductor industry is being said to have the biggest impact, is going to take the biggest hit, as materials needed to make the chips, most of them are coming in from Japan, and now that's going to be tougher to bring in. But there are hundreds of other items that have been included now with this tighter permit system that Japan has just announced. What other sectors besides the semiconductor industry do you think will take a hit?
Well, when you look at the so-called industrial structure, especially close relationship between the Korean industrial structure and the Japanese industrial structure can be described as a kind of one-sided dependence on Japanese core part and component, especially technology-intensive sector. So therefore, we can say basically all technology-intensive sector which is heavily dependent on Japanese core part and component will be heavily affected. So we can think about just in close connection with the semiconductor display industry will be also heavily hit. And also we can think about electric automobile industries, and also precision machinery sectors, and also precision chemical industry sectors will be heavily affected in a very short terms. Yeah.
Now, many analysts are saying that Tokyo's retaliatory moves are a double-edged sword. So they will not only hurt South Korean companies and the South Korean economy, but also Japanese firms, and in turn affect the global economy as well. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think it'll have much of an impact, if at all?
Yes, definitely. Say, since yes, the first direct impact would be that will be negative hit would be Korean industry. But at the same time, we can imagine that the biggest Korean industries are biggest customers of Japanese supplier of core part and components, implying that Japanese supplier of core part and components are about to lose their biggest customers. A direct negative shock on their industries. And strange thing, and something we really need to take care would be there is no voice from those possible losers from Japanese sectors. Means all these trends is heavily controlled by very strong government movement in Japanese sectors. So those damage in Japanese sector might be, I can expect, somewhat heavily controlled and also supported by Japanese government, let's say in short terms. And definitely global value chains will be very, very heavily negatively affected, and most global business might lose a real significant confidence on kind of traditional global value chains. And also in short term, we cannot expect that negative impact in the supply of the semiconductors, since we have the data shows they keep some level of inventories, but in it's kind of long terms, definitely the increased uncertainties in those semiconductor industry will be spread out throughout the whole industry, amplifying the uncertainty, definite negative impact on global economies.
So not just a one-way street then. It'll
definitely
have,
both, yeah.
Others will be caught in the crossfire. Now, President Moon is obviously not happy, as are many South Koreans. He's warned of what he's called severe consequences, although the details of what those consequences are still yet to be announced. He also says he's confident Korea can overcome this hurdle. What options does Korea have to counter Tokyo's latest move? And is scrapping Jisomya one of them, by any chance, you think?
Well, in terms of taking so-called countermeasure to provide another negative shock to the Japanese industry, in that context, since our Korean industry might be described as a one-sided dependency on Japanese core technologies, frankly, we have to say that we should not expect that much negative kind of damages that might be suffered by Japanese sector by the action taken by the Korean government. Well, say some current our president's confidence should come from very solid, structured effort to what kind of substitute all those core part and components which are heavily dependent on from the Japanese imports. So I would say whether we might have a real kind of definite solution with respect to this crisis would be how resolute and concrete and prompt actions can be taken by Korean government and industrial sectors in terms of substituting those kind of threatened kind of core part and components in short terms.
Yeah, and President Moon has previously vowed to support the manufacturing sector to be more self-reliant. So I expect some moves to be happening soon. Now, apart from President Moon Jae-in, Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi held a press conference earlier today after shortly after Japan's decision was announced. He mentioned Korea will also, as we heard before, in a tit-for-tat move, Korea will also remove Japan from its own whitelist. What are your thoughts on Mr. Hong's press briefing as a whole, on his comments?
Well, Korean government should take some actions, and that would be probably easiest and also priceless action we can take. Although definitely we have to be frank that that action we cannot really can expect real heavy significant damage that might be suffered in Japanese industries. Still, Korean government, I think, is required to take some actions, and including that action, maybe they can think about some other symbolic counter actions. Well, instead of kind of thinking about the kind of some possible action that can really damage Japanese industry, I think all efforts should be directed to really building up our own kind of components and part industries that might substitute all those heavily dependent on Japanese imports.
Well, Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your insights. I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave things for now. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Now, our third and final expert on the line, who is on Skype at the moment, Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, Senior Lecturer of International Relations at Cambridge University and Senior Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Chatham House. Dr. Nilsson-Wright, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, South Korea from the beginning had strongly stressed that Japan's trade restrictions against Seoul are unjust and groundless, while Japan is arguing otherwise. Based on the free and open international trade norms, what's your take on this argument?
Well, I think one thing that's really striking about this dispute is the extent to which both Japan and South Korea are inevitably going to be losers of the escalation of this trade tension. The decision by Japan to remove South Korea from its whitelist is being presented by the Japanese government as based on national security considerations. I don't think the evidence really suggests that that's the principal reason, and Tokyo, I think, as many critics have pointed out, has been slow to really provide any concrete empirical evidence to support that claim. What we're seeing is much more emotion in the bilateral relationship. This is unusual, but as I'm sure your viewers recognize, there is, I think, a sense of frustration in Tokyo at earlier decisions that have affected the bilateral relationship, not least the Supreme Court decision to require Japanese companies to provide compensation because of the long-standing issue of Korean slave labor during the colonial period. From Japan's perspective, this is seen as a violation of past binding agreements between the two governments, not least the 1965 normalization agreement. So you have a Japanese government that is looking at this through the legal lens, but is reacting in a way that is actually a departure from traditional norms in a context where states, not just Japan, but the United States, are using trade pressure as a means of resolving diplomatic issues, and that's very unfortunate.
Right. Speaking of the US, many are voicing concerns that worsening Seoul-Tokyo trade tensions will negatively affect the South Korea-US-Japan trilateral security ties and the bilateral military agreement between South Korea and Japan. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think these two issues should be kept clearly separate. GSOMIA is, of course, hugely important. It took time and considerable effort to both sides to agree to this in the first instance. at a time when, of course, both Japan and South Korea are grappling with the question of a nuclear North Korea. They need to be able to share intelligence. Japan provides, of course, valuable satellite intelligence that can be shared with South Korea in understanding what is happening in the North. And I think it would really be counterproductive for the South Korean government at this point to cancel GSOMIA. But I understand the sentiments are very high. There is a sense in which South Korea feels it needs to demonstrate its concern, but this would be the wrong instrument, in my judgment. And of course, as we saw not so long ago with the intrusion into South Korean airspace by Chinese and Russian aircraft, other countries will try and exploit the tension between these two American allies as a means of enhancing their own security posture. So this is probably the worst thing to do at this stage.
Right. As you mentioned before, these tensions help no one. Both South Korea and Japan will be negatively affected. In your view, how should South Korea and Japan narrow their gaps and find a breakthrough?
Well, in all of this, if you look at history, of course, it's been the senior partner, the United States, that has sometimes stepped in behind the scenes to try and bring the two sides closer together. We saw that, of course, very importantly back in 1965 when then US Ambassador to Japan, Edwin Reischauer, was a critical player in building a consensus between the South Korean and Japanese governments, and that's happened often in the past. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has shown no real appetite to play that sort of role. It is itself, of course, practicing its own form of pressure politics through the use of trade sanctions as means of enhancing its own national interests, and therefore we can't rely on the United States. This leaves us in a very difficult position. How can Japan and South Korea work together? My worry at the moment is that if you look at popular opinion, both in South Korea and Japan, that is driving this growing gap between the two countries. There's a danger that it will escalate. We've seen boycotts of Japanese goods in South Korea. What I would recommend is, as a matter of urgency, that both the Japanese and South Korean governments set up their own joint working group to at least attempt to create space in which dialogue can take place between the two countries.
Well, we all certainly hope that there will be a quick resolution to this escalating tensions. Mr. Nilsson-Wright, thank you for your time today.
Pleasure.
Now, South Korean civic groups have lashed out at Tokyo's decision to remove Seoul from its export whitelist. Some 600 organizations across the country took to the streets today to protest the Japanese government. Won Jung-hwan reports.
Frustration and anger has boiled over among many civic organizations in South Korea. Following Japan's cabinet's approval of a proposal to strip South Korea from the whitelist of countries subject to preferential trade status, South Korean citizens and civic groups gathered in the streets to condemn Japan's decision, calling on Abe's administration to withdraw its economic retaliation against Korea. They held up banners that read, "No Abe," while shouting slogans like, "We condemn Abe." One of the leaders of the organization delivered their view on why Abe is curbing exports to Korea.
I think the move by Abe's gang is an attempt to formalize and expand the status of the de facto military through the reform of Japan's constitution. However, we are confident that such an attempt will fail eventually.
He continued by saying that what Abe is doing now can be seen as militarism, and it's the civic organization's responsibility to fight for world peace.
The second purpose behind Abe's goal is to knock down international peace. Our people won't allow that, and the global people who love world peace will never accept it.
The civic organizations will meet again on Saturday for their third candlelight vigil in front of the Japanese embassy, and they are planning a massive rally against the Japanese administration on the Liberation Day of August 15th at Gwanghwamun Plaza. Won Jung-hwan, Arirang News.
Major stock indexes in Asia closed lower today amid ongoing trade disputes. South Korea's benchmark Kospi fell below the 2,000-point mark, while Japan's stock index dropped over 2% sharply after Japan officially took South Korea off its whitelist. Our Lee Min-sun reports.
The benchmark Kospi closed today below the 2,000-point mark for the first time in 7 months. After opening weaker on early Friday morning, it recovered above the 2,000-point mark during the midday trading, but closed at 1,998.13, losing 0.95%. Foreign investors sold more than 390 billion won worth of shares, while local institutions and individuals bought up more than 375 billion won worth of shares themselves. The ongoing trade conflict and geopolitical issues also dragged down the secondary Kosdaq index. It shed more than 1% to close at 615.70.
The political issues are continuing to put pressures on the Korean equity market. If you look at the overall economic growth rate of Korea, it has slowed down quite significantly to below 2% point. This kind of political issue transferring into economic issues that makes growth rate slowing down to be more lasting into the second half of this year.
It wasn't just Korean stocks that suffered. Major indexes in Asia also dropped significantly. China's benchmark Shanghai Composite dropped 1.4%, while Japan's Nikkei dipped 2.1%, losing more than 450 points.
Main reason for that is because of the continuation of the trade dispute that's happening amongst the countries. Clearly, the concerns about the economic trade is there, and that it will result into somewhat of drop of the GDP growth rate. And if this kind of thing continues amongst all the countries, including Korea, Japan, and China, and US, and maybe even Europe, this will put some dent onto the sentiment of the overall economic growth rate as well as the market trend.
The Korean won plunged to a more than 2-year low against the US dollar on Friday to close at 1,198 won to the dollar. The Japanese yen also weakened sharply to drop more than 2.6% against the Korean won. 이민선, 아리랑 뉴스.
In other news, North Korea fired yet more projectiles into the East Sea this morning. It's the second launch in 2 days and third in just over a week. The North is claiming that what it's been testing is a guided rocket system. Our Kim Ji-yeon has the latest.
North Korea launched 2 short-range projectiles towards the East Sea early Friday from Yeonghung in Hamgyeongnam province near North Korea's eastern city of Wonsan. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the projectiles reached an altitude of around 25 kilometers and flew some 220 kilometers, recording a maximum flight speed of Mach 6.9. That's around 8,500 kilometers an hour. This follows the 2 short-range ballistic missiles fired by the North last Thursday and this Wednesday, which, according to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were fired in a northeasterly direction towards the East Sea, all flying at altitudes of less than 50 kilometers. The missiles were presumed to have been launched from the ground using a transporter erector launcher, which is used to move missiles to a desired launch location. North Korea has already released a report and photos of Wednesday's military activity. The regime stated it tested a new multiple rocket launcher, countering the assessment by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that they're short-range ballistic missiles that had characteristics similar to Russia's Iskander-class ballistic missiles. Military experts invited by officials from Seoul's defense ministry on Thursday said further analysis is needed to verify the North's claim that it has succeeded in test firing a guided rocket system. The experts corroborated the Joint Chiefs of Staff's statement that the South Korean military is capable of intercepting all missiles launched by North Korea so far this year, with the existing Patriot anti-missile system based upon simulations. The military experts said the South Korean military already acquired the missile technology touted by the North during the early 2000s. Although North Korea could have acquired the technology, the experts said it's still in the test firing stage and that it's not fully operational due to factors that include lack of resources and infrastructure. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
The nation is in for a scorching weekend as blistering sunshine is forecast.
Let's get more on the weather from our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle.
Now, continuing with that hot weather, daytime temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius are set to bake the peninsula this weekend. And tomorrow, some clouds will develop in the afternoon, but it will be bright enough to bring up the mercury. And as of now, most weather advisories have intensified into warnings, but by the looks of the increasing highs, it's expected that even more areas will be under warning. So don't stay out in the sun for too long. And we won't be able to cool off during the night as most of the morning in the country will begin at 25 degrees Celsius. And into the day tomorrow, Seoul will peak up to 35 degrees, while Gyeongju will see the mercury shoot up to 36 degrees, but in Chuncheon there is a chance of some showers. And until next week, the weather is expected to stay baking hot. Meanwhile, tropical storm Francisco is tracking towards the peninsula, and if it moves as forecast, it's expected to impact the nation by next Wednesday. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That will wrap it up for this slightly longer edition of Arirang News. Thank you, as always, for watching.
We'll bring you more analysis on Japan's removal of South Korea from its whitelist on News in Depth coming up next.